Welcome to this week's End of Days Update. So glad you could be with us this week. We had such a crazy good time in Shreveport, Louisiana this last weekend. We were at Life Tabernacle Church, the very church that first place I ever heard Kenneth Hagin in 1970. Had such a good time. The crowds were amazing. So people are so hungry for information on the coming of the Lord. So we're coming to you every week to look at the different things that point to the coming of the Lord, and specifically the signs of the second coming, and literally what the nations are gathered together for the Ezekiel 38 war. Because the rapture is signless, but the second coming has tons of signs. But if we can see what happens right after the rapture, you kind of have an idea of how close we are for the rapture of the church. So let's pick up with what's happened this last week in Israel. So what we do is we look at what's happening around Israel that points to the tribulation period, points to the Ezekiel 38 war, and points to the coming of the Lord, because it is so blatant. Isn't it interesting that in the scriptures you have more verses written about what it would look like right before the coming of the Lord? Why would the Lord do that? So we'd have a heads up. We could tell how close we are. So we'd have an acceleration mentality, not an escape mentality, but an acceleration mentality. So we pick up with what's happened around Israel. Remember Jesus, he rebuked them. He said, you can tell what the weather's going to be, but you don't know your hour of visitation. So he wanted them to know. Even had a tribe in the Old Covenant called the tribe of Issachar that had an understanding of the times to know what the children of Israel ought to do, indicating if you don't know what time it is, you won't know what you're supposed to do. So let's pick up with what's happened all around Israel. Man, 4 or 5 things that are really, really huge that are the big ones. Number 1, Iran, firing rockets into Baghdad, Iraq, right by the U.S. Embassy. They tied it to that. Remember last week, you had drones from Iran bombing pump stations in Saudi Arabia. You had the Houthi rebels firing missiles as well. So there's all this pressure to respond. It's amazing how calm, and it looks like there's not going to be any kind of response. But along with that, in the middle of that, you have Iran saying that they're ready to annihilate Israel and to annihilate America. So the verbiage coming from the Revolutionary Guard is, yeah, look what we're doing. We're going to keep doing it. We're going to block the Strait of Hormuz. And in fact, in our face and in the rest of the world's face, they said we're going to start enriching even more uranium so we can have more nuclear weapons. So they're coming at it from such a radical standpoint because they're mad about the sanctions. This is the first time they really ever had pressure on them because we held up our end on the sanctions. So the pressure's coming on them. And even, this is kind of interesting, look what the pressure did to them. Hezbollah came out this last week and said, you know what, our funding has gone down because Iran doesn't have the money to fund them. That's the whole purpose of the sanctions, is to cut down money from all those filter ways. In the middle of all that, you had more rockets had to be fired at Damascus this last week. This is the first time in about a month. Israel had to fire missiles from Israel into Syria right by Damascus to take out more weapons depots. So you have things that are pointing to the coming of the Lord right in front of our eyes, pointing to the Ezekiel 38 war right in front of our eyes. Now, something that happened this last week, there was a lot of talk over the Temple Mount, pressure for Israel to share the Temple Mount. That's never going to happen because that's where Jesus is going to reign for eternity. But the thing that really brought my interest this last week, probably more than anything, was, excuse me, the plan from the U.S. about the Palestinian statehood. It looks like the plan's coming back to economical things, which is amazing. I've been waiting for this to happen. It's all about economics. I knew the Antichrist would come on the scene and have a financial solution for the Palestinians and for the Jews. It came out publicly that the solution to all this is not necessarily land for peace, but money for peace. And that's what's going to fund the whole purpose going into the tribulation period. It's the first time that verbiage has ever come out. So seeing that come out like that really brought me joy, like, wow, we are really getting close to the coming of the Lord. Many more things keep happening. We have our aircraft carriers there in the Strait of Hormuz. We have another carrier group in the Mediterranean. So we're set up for what's going to happen right after we leave. So you're watching the setup for what happens after the church leaves. So we're very, very privileged to see these things happening. You got many more things about anti-Semitism coming out, blatant anti-Semitism coming out, even in our Congress, even in the U.S., even in Europe. I like how the popes even come out talking about trying to blend Islam with Christianity. So all these little things that are quiet, but they point to the manifestation of the Antichrist right after the church leaves. I hear people say, how can you tell what the Antichrist will do after the church leaves? Paul said that he can't even come into the picture until the church departs. You have so much authority that you can't have the Christ and the Antichrist here at the same time. So you're watching the earth be set up for all these players to come on the scene because Jesus is just getting ready to come back. So with that, we go look at the signs. How blatant are they? They're precise, they're exact, they're inarguable. You got Israel made a nation, Jerusalem won back, Hebrew language restored, Ethiopian Jews brought back. You got the fertility of the land of Israel. You got the revival of the Roman Empire. You've got the Temple Mount Institute. You got fish showing up in the Dead Sea. You have, crazy as it may sound, you have 172 different species of predatory birds show up in the land of Israel. That's a huge deal. So you got nations in place, Temple Mount Institute in place, you got birds in place, all these things happening because Jesus is about to come back. And there are many more. You got men will be lovers themselves, so we have selfie sticks. But you go from that and go into further, you go to signals. You got blood red moons a few years ago on Passover and Tabernacles. That's radical. When's the last time you had 4 in a row on Passover and Tabernacles? 1967 when Jerusalem was won back. 1948 when Israel was made a nation. 1492 at the Edict of Expulsion when the Jews were kicked out of Spain. So you have significant things happening on those dates. Radical. After that, you've got the Bethlehem star that came out this last year. That's pretty wild. Jupiter, Regulus, Venus. At the birth of Jesus, those 3 planets came together. The constellation was Virgo. This last year, they came together again. First time in 2,000 years. They came together and the constellation was Leo. He's the lion of the tribe of Judah. Many, many more signs that I don't have time to get into every week. I haven't even talked to the ones about September 23rd, Revelation 12 sign, but you had Mercury do a flyby of the sun. The sun went down directly over the Temple Mount at sundown. So many little things pointing to the coming of the Lord. So what do? You help your local church, help your local pastor. This is it. It's not about escaping. It's about how we could hustle to get the message out. Jesus is coming back. We want as many people born again as we can. How amazing is it that we are living in the day where Jesus said the generation that sees 2 of those signs, Israel made a nation and Jerusalem went back. He said, you're it. So we're privileged, we're blessed. He said, lift up your heads, your redemption's drawing nigh. I had a guy say, I say it every week, well, if you preach on the coming of the Lord, Joe, you see everybody's hopes up. Duh, that's right. It's the hope that purifies you. The purpose of all this information on the coming of the Lord is that you'll have joy and you'll have strength and you'll have hope. So why? You're about to see him face to face. I would hope knowing you're going to see him face to face, you'd be kinder, you'd be more merciful, you'd be more like Jesus, because you're about to see his eyes as a flame of fire, feet like undefined brass, voice of many waters. Wow, Jesus coming soon. Have a great week. We'll pick up with what's happened around Israel. So much more keeps setting up for the coming of the Lord. Have a blessed, awesome week. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Thanks for joining us today at the End of Days Update. If you'd like to be notified every time there's a new post, just go to the EDU at josephmorris.com and subscribe to receive email alerts. If these posts and updates have been a blessing to you, please consider making a one-time donation to help get the message out, or even becoming a monthly partner with Joseph Morris Ministries. Thanks again for tuning in to the EDU, and we'll see you next week.